morning to everyone. Warm welcome to everyone tuning in from around the world. My name is Jesse Soltanic, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Before we begin, just want to extend a warm welcome to our featured guests in this event, Dr. Darren Handley from the UK Ministry for Transport, and Dr. Niikuni Tetsuya from the National Traffic and Environment Laboratory in Japan. Both Darren and Niikuni-san are serving as co-chairs of the UNECE Task Force on Cybersecurity and Over-the-Air Issues, which is the primary working group responsible for the drafting of UN Regulation 155 on type approval with regards to cybersecurity and cybersecurity management systems. This regulation was approved in June of this year by the parent body WP.29, or the World Forum for the Harmonization of Vehicle Regulations. So our hope today is that some of the experiences and insights shared by Dr. Handley and Dr. Tetsuya will kind of contribute in some way to your understanding of the cybersecurity regulation, as well as its impact on the industry. So to start, I'll let Darren and Niikuni-san introduce themselves. We'll continue with some questions prepared for them to kind of give an overview of their involvement in the regulation itself. And then we'll kind of open it up for a Q&A with the audience. I will kind of filter those questions and ask Darren and Niikuni to answer those as well. If the planned 45 minutes does not allow us to cover everything, we do have the option with Niikuni and Darren's time to extend by 15 more minutes. So please just keep that in mind, that we will get to as many questions as possible. All right, so thank you, and let's begin. Darren, if you could please introduce yourself to get us going.
Hello, everyone. It's obviously a bit strange not being able to see you, but hopefully I can virtually see you. I'm Dr. Darren Handley. I work for the UK Department for Transport, where I led our work on cybersecurity, both for the automotive and rail sectors, and was co-chair of UNECE Task Force. Still.
Yeah. Great. And Niikuni-san, could you please introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Tetsuya Niikuni of NPSL Japan. I'm a researcher in this laboratory, and also I'm a director of cybersecurity and cybersecurity type approval test center. Thank you.
Great, thank you both for being with us. So Dan, I guess you could kick us off and maybe just give us a little bit of background about how you became involved in the task force on cybersecurity and OTA issues, and what was the process that got you involved initially?
Well, casting our minds back to 2015, the UK government very concerned about cybersecurity, as we still are, and we basically started within the Department for Transport considering what industry should be doing and what we'd like them to be doing, and we published a set of cybersecurity principles setting out our expectations of the automotive sector. These are available still on .gov.uk if you type in cybersecurity principles. Around the same time, in the UNECE, Germany and Japan presented a paper on cybersecurity for guidelines for what they would be looking for. And after discussions, it was thought that actually a proposal for a task force to look at a UN level cybersecurity was deemed a good thing under WP.29, Working Party 29 of the UNECE. And a paper was put forward jointly by the UK, Germany and Japan to establish a task force, and due to my previous work on the UK angle, I was invited to be a co-chair of that task force. and that started in December 2016.
Great, thank you. And Niikuni-san, what was your initial involvement? How did you become co-chair of this task force as well?
Thank you. So actually, I started to work on cybersecurity regulation in 2016 December, because I was assigned by the government, Japanese government, Ministry of Land Transport. So before then, I worked for WLTP, which is test method for light weight vehicles. And I was chair of the group for electrified vehicle test procedure for emissions or energy efficiency. So in 2016, I was moved to the much more safety side of the vehicle. At the timing, I was assigned as a co-chair for the task force for cybersecurity issue in WP.29.
Okay, great. And Niikuni-san, if you could just continue, why do you believe this regulation is important? What is it, there to accomplish, and do you believe is it accomplishing?
So I think the motivation to initiate this work was, of course, automated driving. But if you look at conventional vehicles, they have microprocessor chips and programs. So obviously, we have kind of certain risk to be hacked by every vehicle. So I think this is kind of big motivation to initiate, develop cybersecurity regulation, WP.29.
Okay. Thank you, Niikuni. Darren, why do you see this regulation as important for the industry?
So the regulation sets a baseline, which I think is really important. We've seen over the past 5-6 years academia demonstrating repeatedly their abilities to hack vehicles, and we've seen criminals use cybersecurity flaws to steal vehicles. So many contracting parties, countries, governments saw a need to act, and that self-regulation by industry wasn't sufficient to safeguard the future of vehicles, especially as they get more connected, and the risk of something going wrong increases with those increasing levels of automation that Niikuni-san just mentioned. So I think that's why this regulation is important. It sets in place a great structure for vehicle manufacturers to demonstrate that they are actually taking cybersecurity seriously, and ensures that there's no race to the bottom.
Mm-hmm. So maybe just to continue on that, what are kind of the remaining items prior to entry into force? What kind of work still remains?
So, from the task force perspective, we have actually mostly achieved our goals. So we drafted the regulation, we tested whether it would work in principle. It's quite different to other type approval regulations. So it was a useful exercise testing whether it worked. It got amended after that test phase, and then it got elevated through the bureaucracy of the UN up to Working Party 29, where it actually stated at the beginning it's been adopted. So therefore, the task force doesn't really need to do much more with regards to that, but support any future development of the regulation once it's been exercised a little bit. From the test phase, there's also a lot of learning about how the regulations could be implemented and what sort of evidence could be used, which is why we drafted an interpretation document. It's kind of a Q&A to go alongside the regulation. We've also kind of finished that. So that's now with our parent party in UNECE, which is called GRVA, to be taken forwards, and then that eventually will be put in as guidance under something called RE3, which is a general bucket of guidance in layman's terms. So task force work on that, depending on what comes back from our parent group, GRVA, is largely complete. We just completed that last month, in fact. And then future work, this is where it gets complicated, is there's commitment under a different Geneva Convention called the 1998 Convention to start work towards general technical regulation, which involves a lot more countries than the 1958 agreement, which is what Regulation 155 is under. So that's the next bit of work for the task force to help support that initiation. It's probably quite technical for those who aren't used to UN speak, but that's kind of where we are.
Sure. So we have, on one hand, we have the regulation itself, which again we noted that it was passed in June. And now you guys are working at the task force level, or you completed the work at the task force level about an interpretation document, which is a sense of a guideline for the regulation, or for understanding and potentially implementing the regulation. Now, in terms of achieving those two goals, the regulation and the interpretation document itself, what kind of the biggest challenges for yourself along the way in leading this work?
That's a great question. So I think one of the big challenges to begin with was we're starting from scratch. So it always takes a while to work out what the regulation should look like. Cybersecurity is quite different to the normal type of regulations that UN. So UN looks to harmonise regulations across the globe. So it's done amazing work with safety and emissions, and regulating things like braking systems, and stuff which are quite physical. So you can do a test, which basically says if it passes the test, great. If it fails the test, you don't get your type approval. We had to come up with a different approach for cybersecurity. Luckily, there's another regulation looking at recycling, which we based our approach off of basically having a management system so the company could demonstrate that they could do the processes, and then a actual physical type approval with a set of questions that could be evaluated against to give an approval. So I think that's the biggest challenge, actually working out how you manage something which is not a set piece. Cybersecurity is continually evolving. Whatever's done is a point in time, and how you have a regulation that actually spans the lifetime of vehicles of the vehicle type was probably the biggest challenge, which I think we actually met quite well.
Right. Thank you for that perspective. Niikuni-san, let's move over to you for a moment. Japan has laid out an interesting implementation timeline, which has kind of evolved over time. What do you see are the next steps to really bring this regulation into force in Japan?
Okay, so borrowing this opportunity, I would like to explain the Japanese situation on cyber security regulation. So this is our situation for cybersecurity regulation. You see left side of the screen shows the first page for Japanese regulation. So today, the subject is just for cybersecurity regulation, but we have software update regulation also. And both regulation run like this. So firstly, cybersecurity regulation, which is the Japanese one, actually started 1st April this year. And then, after enforcement of UNR 155, the regulation will be replaced to follow UNR 155 completely. But I don't know the exact date to switch because it is the issue related to our government. But let's make sure this first regulation will be replaced to follow completely UNR 155 after the enforcement. And also we have software update regulation come later than cybersecurity regulation. Will come into force on 23rd November this year. So the timing are slightly delayed to cybersecurity regulation. And also UNR 156, which is about software update regulation, will come into force in January 2021. So after that, this first regulation, Japanese regulation, software update regulation, will be replaced to follow completely UNR 156. This is the Japanese situation. So the first one, so unfortunately, our regulation started a little earlier than UNR. So we have, of course, in principle, this first regulation follow UNR 155, but some exemptions are there, such as 5.3, which is information sharing system, and also 7.4, which is reporting provision. And also Annex 5, it is for kind of list of threat or mitigation. But unfortunately, this Annex 5 is not reflected yet on Japanese first regulation. And also, this is reminder: this regulation is just for automated driving system, not for conventional. For the first phase.
For the first phase.
Yes.
And that second phase of implementation for the wider auto market in Japan.
Yeah. Of course, we have to follow the scope, which is defined in UNR 155 and also UNR 156. But only first phase of Japanese regulation is just for automated driving.
Understood. And great, thank you for that presentation, Niikuni. And maybe, while we're with you, maybe you can just kind of give us an overview of kind of the challenges, maybe expand on what Darren was saying before about a common criteria for a subject like cybersecurity, which is dynamic and constantly evolving. So, you come from a technical service, National Safety and Environment Laboratory. I understand you guys do have an intention to do some of the type of testing for the ministry, Japan. what are the challenges that you foresee coming down the road to actually do this testing for cybersecurity?
Is it my turn?
Yes.
Okay. So I think the biggest feature of new regulation is this regulation has certification of management system. So I think this is quite a big challenge for type approval authority or a technical service. So we expected the protocol to proceed a type approval, which is started with document analysis by a manufacturer. And I think we will have kind of difficulty to check whether the processes defined by manufacturer actually exist in management system. The confirmation of this is quite challenging. So we would like to use kind of auditing process or maybe interview to expert in manufacturer. This is quite important activity, I think, because such kind of activity like an interview or something is very important to see actual existing of their processes. And this style is quite new in comparison with other regulations because if you look at emission regulation, we see a clear criteria they have to comply with. But for cybersecurity regulation, of course, we should have a certain level of criteria, but still we will have kind of difficulty to check whether their process actually exists. So I think we would like to use interview or something effectively to check them.
You kind of verify that the
Yes.
what's written on paper is actually implemented throughout the organization.
Yeah.
And involved. I see. Okay, we have one quick question from the audience for you, which is quite relevant to the previous presentation about implementation. Can you, kind of specify what it means by automated driving system? Does it mean SAE level 2, level 3, 4, 5? What does it mean when you're saying an automated driving system? The regulation is applying already this year, but for everyone else, it will come a bit later down the line.
So actually, I'm not expert for automated driving system, but I can tell we have air case regulation also in WP.29. So I think this kind of system will be targeted. But we don't define exactly, I think.
So perhaps we can look at the ALKS, I believe it's UN Regulation 157.
Yes.
For kind of guidance on those automated driving system levels.
Yes. So ALKS means automated lane keep system. So I would say like slightly limited function for automated driving.
All right, thank you for that. Now for either Niikuni-san or Darren, whoever would like to kind of answer this question. You have, how do you see the relationship between, UN Regulation 155, the Cybersecurity Regulation from WP.29, and, for example, complying with privacy regulations like GDPR? How do they relate to one another? Do they relate to one another? And how do you see that?
So I can answer. The answer is actually in the regulation. So in the scope at the beginning in part 1.4 is it needs to take into account national, regional legislation. Actually, it's 1.3. Sorry, particularly governing the access to authorised parties to the vehicle, and it's without prejudice to that legislation. So, in effect, if a manufacturer wishes to sell a vehicle into the EU market, which is where GDPR is an EU law rather than a UN law regulation, it must respect both the UN requirements and the EU requirements for GDPR. And GDPR obviously is quite wide, so it's not just the vehicle, it's the back end as well. But if they're solely selling to, say, South Africa, then obviously they don't need to take into account GDPR. They need to take in whatever privacy regulations the South African government have in place. So that's the difference.
All right. Thank you. Regional and UN level. That's important distinction. Now, something that I think is also helpful in terms of how it relates to other standards and other regulations. Darren or Niikuni, can you explain the difference between kind of a UN regulation for type of vehicles and standards coming from organizations like ISO or SAE International? How does one relate to the other? Do they relate to one and the other?
So the difference between regulation and standards. Standards can be used to evidence that requirements are met. So there are probably a number of national, regional, and international standards which could be applied to various parts of the cybersecurity regulation. ISO SAE formed quite a unique collaboration to develop a standard to support this regulation. So if the interpretation document actually details quite well where they overlap, and as you'd expect, there's parts where they don't overlap because standards are written by different bodies, so there will be divergence always between best intentions. So my mind has slipped the actual number of the regulation of the standard, and ISO also looking for a standard to support the implementation of the software update process regulation R156. So what the ISO SAE standard does is actually present a way in which the information, particularly for type approval, can be gathered together for manufacturers and their supply base to provide that evidence and argument that actually most of the requirements are met. And, remind me what the number of the standard is. I've had a blank.
Sure. So the ISO standard on ISO SAE standard on cybersecurity is 21434, and the software updates standard in development is 24089.
Thank you.
Sure. And that's interesting. Also, how how the new regulation, obviously applies to the manufacturers seeking type approval for their vehicles. But how would you say the regulation applies, or is it applicable at all, or relevant to entities throughout the value chain, tier suppliers, software suppliers, tier 3, tier 4? How do you kind of see how they will be affected by this regulation, and is it directly affecting them?
So it will, the higher up the value chain, so tier 1 suppliers who produce systems for the vehicle manufacturers will certainly be affected, and then the people who produce parts and components for those systems further down the supply chain will probably be affected to some degree. And the way they'll be affected is actually the requirements will trickle down. So basically you get system user requirements for cybersecurity coming down from the vehicle manufacturers for, this system, I want to understand its risks, what mitigations are built in, how it operates when it's compiled into the vehicle, and what testing have you done. So a lot of the evidence actually presented by the vehicle manufacturer may be actually coming from their supply base. And so that interaction will change, and there will be a trickle down of requirements. And you may see, as a result of changes to vehicle design, that actually there's changes reflected down the supply base for what's put into vehicles. And the bandwidth of ECUs, for example, may change, and other such things, depending on what's necessary in order to mitigate the risks identified. But certainly there will be a trickle-down effect of the regulations on the supply chain.
Sure, thank you. Now kind of switching back to the regulation itself, when you look at the vulnerabilities, threats and mitigations in 27 referred to from Annex 5, obviously cybersecurity is not a static field. It's dynamically evolving time. And we have a question here from the audience about whether or not there are plans to kind of democratize the vulnerability list, or kind of expand on the list of threats and mitigations that should be considered by the manufacturer that's seeking approval.
Sorry, if Niikuni-san wishes to answer, I'm happy for him to monopolize the conversation. Please.
Sorry. So I think, so if you look at the regulation itself, maybe frequent amendment of the regulation will be difficult, because it takes very long time process in WP.29 physically. But I think, of course, in the regulation we define the examples of mitigation or threat, which is reflected in Annex 5, is a kind of baseline for the manufacturer risk assessment. So, firstly, we would like to expect that manufacturer up to date their threat risk or mitigation risk is reflecting quite new information in their management system, because this process is defined in a regulation. So in this mean, Annex 5 is just baseline, not exhaustive list.
Mhm. Thank you. Darren, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say that what we have in Annex 5 in terms of risk and mitigations is pretty high level, which means that it's quite exhaustive, but obviously it will not cover all eventualities. This is why, as Niikuni-san said, it's a requirement on the manufacturers to go above and beyond what's on that baseline. Obviously, there are many bodies out there who can help share information. SAE, and in the US, they have their ISACs. I know ENISA do a lot of good work in this in the EU. And so there's other bodies which can help provide that real-time updates to the list, which again provide a really good background to democratize, to use that word. I like the use of it. The sharing of potential risks. But the actual risk to a system will be much more detailed than what's in Annex 5 because you will know what the actual components are, so you can be a lot more precise about what you see the risks being.
Okay, thank you. Now here's an interesting question. Obviously we're starting to get a good understanding of how this regulation is going to affect the manufacturing process and development process of the manufacturers themselves. But how does this regulation actually help everyday consumers? Niikuni-san or Darren, feel free.
So, from a government perspective, one of the drivers for most governments for wanting this regulation is exactly to protect the consumer interests. So, I think having a type approval against the regulation will provide a degree of confidence to consumers and to their representatives, which are their governmental bodies. But actually, there is a well-argumented level of cybersecurity provided, and also the manufacturers are able to respond should they need to do more than what they have already done.
Okay. Should be an interesting or an easy question to answer. Someone interested to know how big is the Cybersecurity Task Force itself, and how is kind of the industry represented in that working?
So the task force itself, when we have physical meetings, back in the day before the world went crazy, we were getting up to 50, 60 people, and we were limiting numbers due to the fact we were running out of venues where we could host everybody. Since we've been having WebExes, it's been in the hundreds. So we have a large number of attendees. We also have great representation from industry. So we have the industry bodies for vehicle manufacturers, the OICA, and for suppliers, it's Creeper. We have representation from the aftermarket, from motorcycle market, and standards bodies, telecom bodies, and quite a large range of non-governmental organisations actually contribute. And also we have some contracting parties to both the 58 and 98 agreement participate as well. So I think we're really, really well represented from all aspects of the community and the industry.
Okay, thank you. Here's a more specific question to the audience, which I guess is going to be effective based on which kind of approving authority, technical services, actually looking at the vehicle up the type approval. But the question is, there is a statement in the regulation that says until July 2024, cybersecurity should be adequately considered. Now, what kind of guidance would you give on that? And what, sort of look at the interpretation. Is there any guidance you would suggest that person to kind of form their decision making on whether or not something is adequate or not?
Yeah, so the body, the onus is on the vehicle manufacturer to actually argue it's adequate. So the basis of auditing and the assessment is claims, arguments, evidence. So if a vehicle manufacturer or a supplier to that manufacturer was going to argue that what they've done is adequate, they need to have a series of claims to explain why they think it's adequate, and arguments to back up that, and evidence to support the arguments. So claims, arguments, evidence is how. So it's basically presenting the case that is adequate with justifications for that. The reason why it's not defined any further is because, as alluded to earlier, the sophistication of the vehicles put forward will range wildly from having one ECU through to being a fully automated vehicle, and the sophistication of electronics and communication and the risks associated will vary wildly between the two extremes. So what's adequate for a vehicle with just one ECU will obviously probably not be adequate for a fully automated vehicle.
Sure. So everything is relative, and prepare your argumentation as needed. Okay, and here's an interesting question. We have the regulation now under the 1958 agreement, which has a given set of contracting parties to it. You alluded to before, Darren, that the 1998 agreement that we went through has kind of an additional number of contracting parties. What are the first of all, what's the process look like to kind of take a 1958 regulation and expand it to the 1998 agreement? How long does that process usually take, and how do you see that playing out?
So how long does it take to write a new regulation? So there's the major difference between the two conventions is that the 1998 agreement, general technical regulations, are enforcement neutral. So this means that the requirements under them can be implemented either via type approval or by self-certification methods. So this requires them to look at different to what we have under the 1958 agreement, which is just type approval requirements. So the first task which we will be commencing is to actually identify what requirements we have in the 58 agreement which actually could be used under that framework of neutral enforcement. To actually get a regulation under the 1998 agreement, again, there's a technical or bureaucratic procedure that needs to be undertaken, which involves the contracting party sponsoring the regulation to go forwards. So Niikuni-san can correct me if I missed anything, but so there's work we can do in the task force initially of identifying those requirements, and then there's the bureaucratic procedure that must be followed of actually initiating work on a regulation. The timeline for this happening will really depend on how the willingness and the speed at which the UNEC can work, and whether it can, how quickly it can formally begin.
Niikuni-san, do you have anything to add to that?
I think Handley-san's explanation is correct. Maybe I can add more. big difference between 58 agreement and 98 agreement is that 58 agreement has a kind of mutual recognition of type approval. This is a quite important system under 58 agreement. So, which means that type approval protocol should be strictly follow the rule, because one country grant a specific type, maybe the vehicle to be imported to another 58 agreement country. The country have to accept the type approval by other countries. So in this means, maybe a unified quality of type approval would be necessary. So maybe in this means, 58 agreement had kind of more strict rule than 98 agreement. So 58 agreement regulation has kind of many parts related to type approval scheme. So for 98 agreement, this kind of protocols for type approval will be not necessary for 98 agreement. So simply for the next step, we just focus on neutral technical requirement in 58 agreement would be maybe translate to 98 agreement regulation.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks a lot for that. Next question. So first of all, we're over our initial setup, but Niikuni-san and Darren have graciously extended for 15 minutes. We're going to continue for a few minutes now with the additional questions that we have coming in. So stay with us if you are able to. So from taking the regulation as it is today and turning it into a GTR, we actually have a question here that says, why is the regulation not more prescriptive in kind of outlining which technical solutions or processes you must have within your management systems and your vehicles? What is the reason for it being less prescriptive and kind of a bit more open to interpretation?
So it's because regulation takes so long to change. If you start being very prescriptive, such as requiring crypto standards, if we were going to require crypto standards, we'll probably look at ecliptic curves and stuff that are not quantum secure. So, or if we're looking from industry standards, you'd be looking at probably stuff that would be out of date pretty quickly. So actually getting really prescriptive is a bad idea for cybersecurity regulations, because it doesn't allow evolution. And again, you look at how cybersecurity changes for hardware, and a firewall, once upon a time, was the answer. Now gateways were the answer, HSMs were the answer. HSMs now are getting replaced. So by new technologies coming in. So you see this evolution coming in about not only the hardware but the systems. So it's very dangerous for regulation on cybersecurity to prescribe what a vehicle should be designed like, especially when it's over such a raft of different types of vehicles, from trailers through to trucks, off-road, on-road, and motorbikes in the future maybe.
That makes sense. Niikuni-san, would you like to add anything to that?
Maybe I add that kind of aspect that vehicle has fairly long lifetime in comparison with other items, OT items or something. So we have to take care of that kind of aspect because when we have quite strict requirement on a specific timing, but the vehicle has maybe over 10 years lifetime, this kind of situation is quite risky for if you look at the regulation because it is quite strict. So I think cybersecurity issue has kind of aspect.
Okay, well that's certainly helpful. Why it's not more specific certainly makes sense. Kind of a interesting follow-up question that is, where might the regulation be not fully, or where may you not be fully satisfied with the outcome of the regulation? Where might you be able to improve on the regulation?
So I think the regulation has been very well debated first off in both the task force and outside the task force and within the UN. So as a first cybersecurity regulation, I think actually it's got a decent amount of teeth to it. So I wouldn't say that there's any shortcomings immediately in it. Obviously, once the regulation has been in force for a while and we have that experience of actually testing it and we get that information sharing from the technical services who will do the evaluations, then with that experience, we'll be able to see actually things that could be improved. So there's uncertainty maybe on how to implement the cybersecurity management system and actually how to evaluate it, which experience may help provide a bit more rigidity to the assessment. So that's partly why we have the interpretation document to help harmonise that. But obviously, if parts of that look really good, they could be taken into regulation. So I think that's probably where we would go in the future, is learning from the experience of actually its implementation to identify things that could be changed or improved.
Thank you.
I would like to agree with Handley's opinion. So so in Japan, we started slightly earlier with our regulation, and I feel that we need more experience, especially for the validation of management systems. So, of course, experience is necessary for manufacturer, but also for type approval authority or technical service. So, after accumulation of the experience between countries, maybe we could consider kind of modification of regulation in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And kind of the final question, just given the time that we have right now, there's a question here about whether or not CSMS will have to consider vehicles that are currently on the street already, type of vehicles already on the market. Will the CSMS of manufacturing need to consider those vehicles?
I might leave that to Niikuni then.
I think it is related to transition provision regulation. So in Japan, firstly, we started with automated driving system. And maybe in near future, we will apply the regulation for newly sold vehicles. And then after that, maybe we will consider the vehicle on the market. But kind of implementation will be done gradually. And also it is depend on the country's strategy. So it's really hard to tell now. But actually, this is a kind of transition provision issue. That is the situation.
Great. All right. Well, this is getting towards the end of the time we have. So first of all, I want to thank Niikuni-san and Darren for your time and joining us here to answer our questions of the audience. That was really much appreciated. To the audience, if you have additional questions, please send them our way, and we'll do our best to get you answer to those questions in a timely manner. And for now, that's all. Thank you very much to everyone who participated.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Be well. Have a great day.